Wow, look at this room. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. My name is Michael Lubas, so I'm the founder of Praxeal.io, which is a web application security company that does have a heavy focus on Elixir. So the company was started in 2022, so about 2 years now. It's fully bootstrapped, no venture capital funding, and I'm very happy to say that it is profitable as well. I'm very grateful to be sponsoring ElixirConf this year. All of our customers are using Elixir and Phoenix in production, so you can imagine how excited I am to be here. Before starting the company, my professional background was in cybersecurity. I worked for a number of companies, did offensive work, penetration testing, and sort of security engineering. Here are a few of the Praxeal.io customers. Very grateful to be the security provider for the ElixirConf website as well. So for today, we're going to be talking about the Elixir security roadmap. And naturally, we need an Elixir app to discuss that. So here we have Black Cat projects. And I just want you to picture a project management software where you could create projects, tickets, epics, you could share projects with people in your company, you could attach files. I think most people here can imagine what that is. So the way this business works, Black Cat projects, a user signs up or a business does a deal and they pay with a credit card, maybe the larger ones have an invoice, they're storing very sensitive customer data. Now, the executives at this company say, we heard about some data breaches and we're naturally concerned about this. What are we doing to mitigate this risk? Are we secure? And this is a very good question for executives to be asking. Equifax is a credit ratings agency over in the United States. They had a very, very high profile breach a few years ago. The financial settlement cost alone was $425 million. And that's not including, the executives were dragged in front of the government, Congress. Several senior executives had to leave. It was a very notable security incident. How did that happen? So Equifax was using Apache struts for development. So you have Java, that goes to Apache struts. You have Rails, that goes to Ruby. And then you have Elixir, Phoenix. Same idea. The web application framework is struts. And CVE 2017-5638, that's just the technical number for the vulnerability. It's what's called remote code execution. So what the heck does that mean? Think of a web application where you can SSH in as a developer. Only developers should be able to do that. This vulnerability let a bad guy send one HTTP request, and then that did some stuff in the code, and return really the equivalent of production SSH access. It was very, very bad. So when you hear the term remote code execution, that's what that means. It's a type of vulnerability that allows a bad guy just production SSH access. And what happened with Equifax was this exploit for the vulnerability was posted on GitHub. So before that happened, there were only a very small number of people that could actually use the vulnerability to break in. Maybe 5 or 10 people in the entire world knew about it. After that was posted on GitHub, anyone that could go on GitHub and run the script could break into any server that was running the vulnerable version of struts. So you can see how when the exploit becomes public, the skill level to exploit it goes down. So, practically speaking, you're working at an Elixir company, how would a data breach happen? What is the highest probability event that would lead to that? And realistically, it's going to be remote code execution, which is the Equifax thing, or a SQL injection, which is where you send some SQL statement, it's not being sanitized or parameterized correctly, and then that gets executed by the database, sort of like giving the attacker the equivalent of just database, like SQL runner access, extremely bad. So these types of vulnerabilities can occur in sort of the top layer code, so the code that you're working on every day to develop the web app. It can also be in the libraries, so that would be Phoenix, Plug, a dependency. Those are both areas that you have to be aware of. Okay, technical background. You are the CTO of Black Cat Project Management today. You don't have all the time in the world to listen to security people drone on You have a limited amount of time and budget. What do you do to prevent the data breach? How do you manage this project? What tasks are the highest priority? That's what this talk is about today. So I published this guide, the Elixir Security Roadmap, a CTO level guide. You could see how it's applicable to the previous example. You can go on the Praxis.io website and download this if you'd like, but you don't really have to have any background knowledge to appreciate this talk. So, what is the first item on the list today? Might be surprising, it's not anything that sounds really hacker related. It's called asset management and updates. So this company, Black Hat Projects, how many Elixir apps do they have? What version of Elixir, Phoenix, Plug are they running? Do you have the full list of dependencies that's in production? If one of those dependencies suddenly had this remote code execution problem, do you think you could patch it within 24 hours? That is the most important thing for a CTO or a security-minded executive to have in mind. And Elixir actually makes this pretty straightforward. You don't have to rely on the mixed lock file. You probably have it in GitHub. The reason I'm going to talk about this runtime thing is what's in GitHub doesn't necessarily always match what's in production. It should, but as we all know, the CI/CD pipelines are fun to debug and things can happen. So I prefer to get the actual loaded applications at runtime, which you can do very easily, and then you can just use that for the inventory. There's also vendor products naturally that do this, but I just want to focus on why we are doing this. When Equifax happened, really the Apache Struts vulnerability came out, every security team that was using Java, whether they liked it or not, their number one task that day was patch the Struts boxes. And it didn't matter if it was the weekend or they had a holiday or vacation, that just was the priority. They had to do that or they knew what was kind of lurking as the consequence. So that's why this is really critical. It's much better to do this during a workday when it seems lower priority than as the incident is about to happen because the exploit just became public. Second point is developer education. So most Elixir apps, I would say, are actively developed. You don't have that, oh, we have a PHP app from 20 years ago and it hasn't been touched, but we don't want to touch it. Most Elixir apps are very actively developed. You all probably push and deploy code very frequently. And as developers, you have to be aware of the security threats that are relevant to web applications. This talk won't go into detail on that because that's an 8-hour training, really, longer. But if you've heard of these acronyms, cross-site scripting, CSRF, RCE, OWASP Top 10, that's sort of the guide. If you see those, you're going down the right path. That's general web security knowledge, but there's also Elixir-specific items, which it's much harder to find information about that. So if you are generally interested in web application security, I like this book, Web Application Hacker's Handbook, the 2nd edition. It was published in 2011, so unfortunately it is a bit outdated now. The author is the founder of Portswigger, which makes this very good tool called Burp Suite, which a lot of pen testers use. Today, what I would really recommend is the Web Security Academy that Portswigger puts on to learn what the heck is XSS, SQL injection, how do I do an RCE. The Web Security Academy is really excellent. However, it won't have any material about Elixir. And that's something you'll see in just the field of web application security research. They go for Python or JavaScript, or you just don't see Elixir. So I'm one of the authors of Potion Shop, which is an intentionally vulnerable Elixir application. It has all of these security problems, so it allows you to take the knowledge that you're picking up and then apply it to Elixir, which is really valuable because for OWASP Top 10, it'll say deserialization of data for remote code execution. Reading that is one thing, but then actually exploiting a binary to term exploit, which is really fun, you should do it. That hands-on lab is very, very valuable for developer education. I host trainings. I actually did one yesterday at this conference. But you really, even if your company doesn't have the budget for it, there's so much material out there that's just free. Potion Shop is open source. Those labs are free. You can just pick it up if you want to. Okay. The next point is Elixir code security tools. I want to talk about these because they're very important. Raise your hand if you use Soblo, or you know what Soblo is. Okay, good amount. It's the static analysis tool for Elixir. So that just means you take your source code, put it in Soblo, and the output is, here's a SQL injection bug, here's a remote code execution bug. It's open source, very useful, highly recommend, put it in CI/CD. Has anyone used Mix Audit for their dependencies? Raise your hand. Okay, a bit fewer. You might have also used Dependabot with GitHub. So essentially what Mix Audit does is if you have a vulnerable library, it'll check and alert you and say, hey, you're about to put this library in, it has a very bad, Equifax tier problem. Maybe don't merge this PR yet. Also open source, you can put it in CI/CD. And then finally, Mix Hex Audit is actually built into Hex. So you can just run that, get the retired dependencies. And the reason that's relevant for security is those are dependencies that are no longer maintained. So if there is a security problem with them, which happens with all software, really the important point is being able to patch and adapt to it. Retired dependencies, they can't do that. So it's a very bad day. If you have a bad vulnerability in a retired dependency, you're gonna have to rewrite all of that code, or it's just not gonna be fun. The next part I want to make is about Exploit Guard. So this is an open source library I released. It's also part of Praxio.io. It's able to actually detect that Equifax problem, the remote code execution, at runtime, and it uses Erlang's built-in tracing. So it's pretty cool. I did want to do a minor PSA. I do like GitHub. I'm a big fan of their work. One thing with Dependabot is it'll say on the website, compatible with Elixir. And you can see it's bumping paginator here. However, because Elixir isn't supported in their dependency graph product, it actually won't alert you to the security problem in paginator. It'll just prompt you to bump it, but that's with all the other non-security bumps. Just something to be aware of. The mixed steps audit command, this is what the vulnerability looks like. So you can see remote code execution in paginator, critical, just patch to the higher version. Just wanted to mention that. The other thing with Soblo, it's a very useful tool. It's also written from the perspective of a security expert. So some developers can find it a bit difficult to use. A big part of doing a Soblo project is getting all the findings and triaging them. That's what I always do when I have a pen test project. I find it very valuable, but if you're not a security person, if you don't have that experience, it can be a little bit frustrating. So I've released this guide. It's open source on the Praxio.io GitHub. It's sort of a guide to each Soblo finding. So the next time you have a Soblo finding, you're like, what does this mean? I don't know. Google doesn't return anything. You can check this and it'll have some more context for you. This is also a blog post I wrote. It's up on the Praxio.io blog. It's the mountain. It's about how to plan and scope a Soblo project. So if you're manager, you're doing project management, and you go, let's use Soblo. Running Mix Soblo is the 5-minute part of that project. The absolute bulk of that is the triaging and mitigating and patching findings. And it's good to have that plan before you dive into the project. So that's Elixir security tools, and I want to talk about penetration testing. Also called Web Application Security Assessment. This refers to a project where you have the web app, you want a security expert to look at it, try to hack it, and then give you some context and a report about how to improve the security of it. It is not a scanner. It shouldn't return a list of vulnerabilities. If your pen test provider just gives you the output of a scanner, not to be harsh, but you should not hire them. Really, a good pen test is done by somebody with experience in the technology that you're using, and they're able to intelligently reason about your business and the risks that are most relevant for you. And that's the limitation of all code security tools, is they're code security tools. They don't have any context about your business or what you care about or the motivations for the pen test. That's why doing the pen test yearly is typically the recommended, is really recommended. The other part is your application likely has custom functionality, and non-Elixir code is very relevant, such as your underlying web server, is your database exposed to the public internet, Are you processing file uploads with image magic? That's a big risk that you have to be aware of. A good pen test will be able to give you that context and really help you make better decisions. So I do really recommend engaging somebody with security experience because it makes the whole process of planning security work. You're just less likely to waste time on something that isn't really relevant for your business. All right, checkpoint. We've got asset management and updates, developer education, Elixir code security tools, and you've done a penetration test. So what else could go wrong? Bot attacks and DDoS. So distributed denial of service, this just means you get a bunch of traffic. The goal is to crash the application. A bot attack is a little more subtle. For example, if somebody wants to hack your users, what they like to do is take these lists of credentials. So think of an email and a password pair for some website with low security. Even if you're a bank, some of your users probably use the same username and password as they did for their dog spa website, whatever. And then when that website gets hacked, somebody writes a bot to do all the login attempts. And it's an extremely effective technique. Common tools, rate limiting. Actually, I really recommend rate limiting. CAPTCHAs are kind of annoying and people don't like them. You can also go with a dedicated vendor for this. For an example of what's the impact of this in the real world, 23andMe is a genetics company, so they store very, very sensitive data about people. And from what's come out so far about this incident, it was just credential stuffing. The bad guy didn't do some kind of remote code exploit, super cool hacker. It was just a bot that did login attempts, and it got 23andMe for 6.9 million users. And that was very bad. So also related to this point is logging and monitoring. You probably already have this not for security, but for debugging and tracing in production. So good events to log are, account creation, credit card transactions. This is a big risk if you have a web app where users just sign up from the public internet, because there's these bad guys that have lists of credit cards, and they have 100,000 of them, and they want to determine which of these cards are valid and which don't work, and they're stolen. So they'll write a bot to make 100,000 accounts, and they'll do 100,000 your small transactions. And the growth team goes, oh, great, we made all this money. You're about to be banned from your payment provider. Unfortunately, it's going to be a very bad day. So if you can set up an alert that says we've seen 100 times the normal login volume, that's a very good security control to have in place. And then the last point is on external vulnerability reports. You might have also heard of bug bounty programs. So this is a very accepted behavior today. People look for security problems in your website, and then they don't want to actually hack you. They just want to report it to you for some status in the community or a financial reward. And it can catch very high severity problems like SQL injection, remote code execution. The warning I have, I've managed bug bounty programs myself. You will spend a lot of time triaging irrelevant findings that aren't useful, and that is a very expensive use of engineering hours. So number one, do all the other items on this list first. They're ranked in priority. And if you have all of those done and you want to start a bug bounty, don't start with rewarding like cash. Just accept reports, see how it goes, and then kind of slowly build it up. Sometimes you can only invite high reputation people. Just don't dive into bug bounty thinking it's going to solve all your problems. It's a very advanced plan for a company. So, in summary, the number one thing is asset management and updates, developer education, code security tooling, penetration testing, and then the DDoS and bot attacks, logging and monitoring, and external vulnerability reports. If you actually do all of this work effectively, you are in the top 95th, top tier percentile of all companies. There are companies that have multi-million-dollar security budgets that know they should have all of this stuff done, and they just don't because it is difficult to do. So that concludes my presentation. Let's take some questions.
So are there any questions from the audience? One over there. So I'm going to ask for some help. Can you just pass?
Well, thank you so much for the talk. Really interesting one. I'm a little bit confused here, right? Maybe we'll clarify. So in the beginning you said that these are advices for the small companies on tight budget with not much time, right? And there seems to be like a lot of things to do that. Wouldn't it be cheaper to do all those things, but sort of allocating one developer to do that thing?
That's the thing. Yeah, you really have to work with your resources. So for example, asset management updates. The good news for a small company is you might not have that many apps. So you kind of get like, that's far more difficult for a big company. Or if you only have a few developers, you could send them to a conference for training, which is a bit cheaper than hiring a trainer to come in. So you sort of play to your strengths in that regard. You don't have to be a big company. And it's a bit sad too, because you might think, oh, we're a small company, so we don't have to worry about this. Particularly for bot attacks, scammers actually target small companies because the big companies have the protection in place. So it's unfortunately a cost of doing business to be aware of. Good question.
Any more questions? We still have.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. Really interesting. So, as someone who tried to introduce SoBelow into a code base, and I guess maybe I will have to read your blog post that you've showed. But yeah, I was wondering if you can expand on any advice on like triaging false positives, because yeah, in my case that was just a blocker too. It was a big piece of work to go through that the false positives list.
There's a few options. Your pen test provider should be able to do that for you. If you're paying for a pen test, just mention, hey, can you just go through and triage all the SoBelow findings? It's related to work. They should say yes. If they say no during the quote, don't hire them. If you're doing your own work, I would say the data flow is the biggest thing. There's not really a good way to do this programmatically yet, but if you have a function, and let's say SoBelow is like, all these functions are vulnerable to SQL injection. That's really bad if it's true. But if you can sort of trace and prove, oh, this input is from a defined static thing, mark it false positive and move on. As long as user input can't get to it, you're probably good. That is dependent on the issue, though. You should read the guide. Good question, though.
We had one other question in the back there.
Hello. Hello. Thank you for the presentation. I have a question is, what will be the impact of using direct dependencies from GitHub? Because sometimes we just put a dependency direct from GitHub.
Oh, interesting. So the risk doesn't really change if it's on Hex versus GitHub. I shouldn't say that, actually. Hex is really good. Hex has very good security controls. For example, each package is immutable. It can't change. Although with GitHub, you usually pin it to a hash. But like, let's say the risk is you're like, we're going to pull off this branch from GitHub. And then that person's account gets hacked. And then somebody puts in a backdoor. So I would say Hex is more secure than GitHub in that way.
Okay, I think we're pretty much on time, so maybe I would redirect anybody that still has questions to put them on Hoover, on the app, and Michael, you maybe can answer over there.
Yep.
So please thank the speaker again.